and welcome to Seeking Alpha Interviews. I'm Jane King at the NASDAQ market site in Times Square, and with me today for our first Seeking Alpha interview, Michael Kramer, founder of Mott Capital, also a Seeking Alpha contributor. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you here for
Honored
the first
to be the
one.
first, yes.
And we're going to talk about interest rates. So
Okay.
Huge topic here. We're entering the month of December.
Sure.
We've got the ECB meeting, the FOMC meeting, Bank of England meeting. I mean, there's tons of central banks meeting globally.
Right.
Do you see some kind of global interest rate increase happening?
Currently, the market is beginning to price in here, at least in the U.S., expectations of inflation returning because of the pro-growth policies that the Trump administration has laid out throughout the course of the election cycle. So that sets up a really interesting conundrum for both the Fed and the ECB, the BOJ, and of course you throw into all of this the Italy referendum coming up on December 4th, and things could really get pretty interesting in the month of December for certain.
It's amazing how the market has kind of just steamrolled the Fed and just said, look, we're going to raise interest rates whether you like it or not. Right,
essentially, and the market's essentially done that, right? I mean, back in July, the 10-year was trading around 140. And today it's trading around two and a quarter, right? 230 almost. So that's like almost 3 tightenings right there. So that really, brings in the question: does the Fed need to raise rates, and what will other central banks do in response to the Fed potentially raising rates? And remember, the ECB goes first. So if the ECB does something to try to make their policy more accommodative, that, in my mind, takes the Fed off the table in December.
Interesting. Well, so does this really mean more growth? I mean, I know the market is pricing that in based on some of Donald Trump's promises during the campaign, infrastructure spending and so forth. Do you think this really means growth?
Well, hopefully, right? We haven't really had any economic growth in terms of GDP here in quite a while. We've been battling deflationary forces in the economy, both in the U.S. and abroad, right, which is what's led to a lot of this aggressive accommodation and monetary policy throughout Europe and Japan and here for the last, near decade already. And essentially, what we're beginning to see is the market's hopes of inflation returning and growth returning, although we're not probably in reality going to start seeing any of these fiscal policies that Donald Trump has laid out until the fall, right? Because by the time he gets inaugurated and you start getting bills sent into Congress and money actually starts being dispersed, it may not be until late summer, early fall. So we could be in a very different place by then than where we are right now.
So let's talk about the new administration. We're going to have a Republican president, Republican Congress.
Right.
I mean, maybe the market's just pricing in things are going to actually get done.
Right.
There's not going to be the stalemate is broken.
And I think that's the biggest piece here, right? Is the night of the election, when I was watching the results come in and the market was plunging and the peso was soaring. I remember watching the peso go from 1860 to 20 and a quarter versus $1 in a matter of hours. I began to think, like, what is the market thinking here that the world is going to change when it was just that expectations of who was going to win the election was changing. But in reality, the thing that immediately dawned on me was that you're going to have a Republican president and a Republican Congress. Things will actually get accomplished. Whether they're for good or bad, time will tell. But we're going to have progress, and there shouldn't be this gridlock, and we should begin to actually see the piece of that we've been missing the last 8 years, which is fiscal policy on top of monetary policy, which will make it for a much more powerful force in driving the economy.
Well, even some of the Fed governors have been relieved, I think, that we're going to actually see government policy implemented. The burden is off of them to totally do everything.
Right, sure, and that's true, right? Because what's one thing that Ben Bernanke talked about when he used to go to Congress? Talk about the lack of fiscal policy. Janet Yellen, fiscal policy. Mario Draghi, the need of fiscal policy. They've all talked about fiscal policy, which we haven't had from any government, with the exception of Japan, really, over the last several years.
Okay, so what would be the long-term plays of a rising and pro-growth environment? We saw tons of money go into bank ETFs right after the election.
Right, sure.
Banks, and would there be big banks, small banks, both? I mean, what would be some good plays here?
Well, I would assume probably some of the larger banks, some of the more regional banks would do well. I think obviously also things that should do well in an environment where rates are going up and you actually have real growth in inflation would be things like materials, things like energy should do well. They're not to this point, and I think that's because that part of the market is still probably a little unsure about how much actual spending is going to be done. Likewise, sectors that won't do well will be things like utilities and staples, right? Because those are higher yielding, slower growing type of companies.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Michael Kramer, for joining
Sure.
us on Seeking Alpha Interviews. And thank you as well for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.